Susan Barnes, and I'm the rector here. And I'm professionally honored and personally thrilled that Mariann is here. I don't think I have to introduce Mariann to you. In fact, you all know her better than I do. Most of you know her very, very well. Some of you have come to St. John's since I did. And in case you don't know, she is the Bishop of Washington, D.C. As we celebrate our 100th anniversary, the cornerstone was laid on the tower in 1916, we're having a wonderful time looking back at the people who shaped this parish, and as Jane has said in her history, standing on the shoulders of giants. And it seemed particularly appropriate to honor Mariann, whose tenure, 18-year tenure here, was the most generative period in the modern life of St. John's. You can measure that in lots of ways. There are statistics, there are numbers. You can look at the parish, the parochial report, the first year she was here, and the parochial report the last year. And of course, there are multiplications of members and multiplications of ministries, reaching in and reaching out. But the numbers are only a sign of the growth, the spiritual growth. And that Mariann, fostered by her preaching and her presence, extraordinary. And we are still benefiting, obviously, from that, and always will. And of course, there is expansion of space, the library and offices, improvements of spaces and elsewhere, but of the many things that I could just go on and on about the fruits of Mariann's legacy. The one I want to highlight is her leadership of leaders. Mariann is someone who knows how to recognize and cultivate the gifts of leadership in you. And it is a great gift, and I walked into this parish just over 4 years ago and found myself surrounded by the most remarkable leaders, people who, of gifts, of brilliance, and of humility. You do this, you come and you bring your gifts, offer them with humility and service, because you're just part of the body of Christ. And Mariann, I think of the many things for which I'd like to thank you, that is probably the greatest. And it is a quieter gift, of course, but it is huge. And so now you're going to tell us you're going to share some thoughts about leadership, and we are so happy to welcome you home. Me on task, and she reminded me that the way Mariann wants to structure this is 30 minutes of talk and then Q&A, and we staff will pass out pen and paper to anybody who raises their hand. Chad's going to lead us in some songs while we do that, and then we'll bring the questions up to Barb and Craig, and they'll shuffle them and hand them over to Mariann. Okay?
It means more than I can say to be standing among you, to see so many beloved friends and colleagues, and also to be in the company of those who have come to St. John's since Susan has come. It means the world to me to know that St. John's is thriving under Susan's leadership and that of your extraordinary staff and vestry and the deep bench of leaders here. It's also wonderful to see some colleagues from around the community. And I was thinking as I was sitting, trying to put my thoughts together, of the mission statement, which I still have committed to memory. It says that St. John's is a community that celebrates the gift of Christian community and welcomes all without distinction to share the joys and pains of life's passages. And I could sit down now, and it's been a celebration of great joy for me. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to reflect back on my years here with all of you and what those years meant to me. And I have to say, I do so with some trepidation, acknowledging the multi-layered complexity of memory. There was a lot of goodness in our years together, and there were times of real struggle. And over 18 years, I did my best as your rector, but I made some significant mistakes, and I hurt people, for which I will stand once again this evening and ask for forgiveness. And of course, what I might remember from a certain period may not be what some of you remember. And let me say in advance that your memory is probably more accurate. Such is the mystery and the nature of and the interpretation of memory. And I may not get all the sequencing right, and I'm not going to name a lot of names, because if I did that, that's all I would do, is name names. And rest assured, I'm going to leave a lot out, or else we'd be here all night and into the morning. But let me begin with prayer. Lord, our gracious God, I thank you in the presence of these people for St. John's Church and for this time. And I ask that you help me speak words that honor your Spirit in and through and among us, your love that surrounds us on every side. Amen. Amen. So, just a reminder for those of you who were here when I first arrived, and the background for the rest of you. I was called to be the rector of St. John's. I was 33 years old. Moved to Minneapolis with my husband Paul and our two sons, ages 5 and 2. And it felt like a call in a way that I had never experienced before. And I've only experienced one other time in my life, and that was when I became involved in the process that led to my election in Washington. And I felt from the beginning, and you need to know this, that I could be myself with you, that there was no need to put on airs. I had no idea what it meant to be a rector, but I felt that I could learn among you. And St. John's in those years was an optimistic place. The leadership at the time spoke of the years before I came with tremendous pride and a sense of accomplishment for very good reasons. And the church liked itself, liked its identity, liked its history. It was small, but it was plucky. It was a lot bigger than it had been just a few years before, and there was a lot of pride about that. Great sense of humor. Had grown significantly under the previous rector. It had a strong legacy of service, justice, and compassion. The most strong-willed people I had ever met. Back in those days, right? No, it's different now. I does not believe how opinionated the people were back then. The parish I had served as an associate for 5 years before, in that parish, this is important background, the rector had self-destructed in some really painful ways. And I saw that firsthand. And I saw what happens to a community when a leader isn't healthy and when a leader is not connected. And that made me want to be a good leader. It also made me a student of leadership, which I am to this day. And let me say one more thing, just setting the stage, and that's about my husband, Paul Budde. We met in seminary. Paul was studying for the Roman Catholic priesthood. Not for me, he left that path. And we married. He followed me to Central America, back to a year in Virginia so I could finish school. Then we moved to Chicago so that I could be an associate at a parish there. And as he was trying to discern what his path of life would be, he decided that he would go back to his previous degree before seminary. He had a PhD in mathematics. And he found a job at a small Catholic college in southern Michigan, which he loved. And the time I was interviewing for St. John's was not a good time for him to move, professionally speaking. But he, in his generous way, was open. And he read the profile, which just kind of got spit out by the machine in New York City that spit out those things. And I read it to him, and he said, "That sounds like you." And he came out with me for the interview. And when we flew back, the mathematician that he was, he helpfully pointed out that I had a 1 in 5 chance of being called to serve as a rector. But he said, if they do call, you have to take it. St. John's, parishes like St. John's don't come around every day. And we moved here. And he was optimistic. He thought that he could, there are a lot of schools of higher education here in the Twin Cities. He really thought that he could get a position here, teaching math. And for 18 excruciating months, I watched him try to do that, taking adjunct positions at the various colleges around here, and not ever getting a foot in the door in an institution for a tenure track. And I tell you, if I had known beforehand what it had cost him for me to come to you, I wouldn't have done it. But he never wavered in his conviction that this was the right place for me, and therefore it had to be so for us. And after a period of time, he made a switch and he started taking actuarial exams. And thanks to Jane Hockenstadt, who was a member then and is now back a member here, she carried his resume past the HR department of her reinsurance brokerage firm and put it on the desk of the head actuary. And he looked at it, and Paul had a job offer the next week. He was also an extraordinary partner in all of our years of parenting, which allowed us to raise 2 extraordinary sons. You also, those of you who were there in those years, helped us to raise them, for which I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. So when I arrived in 1993, I was ecstatic to be called. I was worried about my family, but I was hopeful. And I never doubted my call to serve you, which was a good thing because it didn't take long for reality to set in. Let me remind you, members of the search committee were unanimous in calling me, but apparently about not much else. There were a lot of hurt feelings, there was conflict, people didn't like each other, and one by one they all trapped in my office to tell me so. How was I going to deal with that? How to set the tone for dealing with conflict? How to reconcile the fact that in a relatively small church, there were some people who actually didn't like each other. The first vestry meeting was one of the most intimidating experiences of my life. And I had the distinct impression that there were some people, believe it or not, who were trying to intimidate me. Not consciously, of course, but they wanted to see what I was made of. And I realized that, all right, I have to take the reins of this place. And I also had to build relationships with those who scared me the most. And so the first person I took to breakfast was Kate McKinnon. because she was the lawyer who was explaining to me my contract. She wasn't nearly as intimidating over breakfast. But it was a good lesson that I needed to move toward the people who were as strong as all of them were. The first stewardship campaign, the money didn't come in. We had a budget of $140,000 and it did not, we weren't making it. And I learned in that first year and nearly every year going forward that raising money here was not going to be easy. And it was also one of the most important jobs I had to figure out. Let's see, the music program. We needed to hire a music musician right away, and we had exactly $5,000 in the line item for that salary. And the organ, which had been built a few years back, and that was a painful thing because the parish, you raised a lot of money for that new organ, and it was a disaster. An albatross for anyone who played it. Children's ministry was growing, but the infrastructure wasn't keeping up with it. Investing in children and young people is expensive. Parish had gotten out of the habit of that, and there was some real ambivalence about investing in those things, investing in staff and building and resources. The parish had become accustomed to being lean and being poor and giving themselves away, and it felt greedy, it felt selfish, it felt unchristian to spend money on us. And that tension of investing in the church for strength and commitment versus committing ourselves to justice and being out there in the world was a tension that was part of our life together for the entire time I was here, which is a good tension. We would never want that not to be a tension. But I also found it to be a false dichotomy after a while because I knew that if we didn't invest in strengthening this place, we wouldn't have as much to offer. And that was part of my job. My job was to build the infrastructure that would allow this community to thrive and to grow. Human sexuality came up as a topic of anxiety early on, and that really surprised me because the search committee had been so clear with me that the congregation was completely at peace. Fully reconciled with its position of full inclusion of gay and lesbians in the congregation. And one of those members asked me about a sacramental blessing for her relationship. And I said, sure, that wouldn't be a problem. Let me just make sure it's okay with the vestry. And to say that the vestry was not of my mind about that would be to put it mildly. And it was really a source of tremendous anxiety. Now, ultimately, as you know, it all worked out. And we became a congregation where same-gender unions were celebrated. But it took a while to get there. We had to work at it. Remember, this was 1993, right? And finally, some of the people who had been in the close leadership circle and really good friends with the rector before me, they missed him. And they were rather open about that with me. They were disappointed in me. I didn't spend my time the way he did. I didn't go to the same parties. They clearly didn't see me as their spiritual leader. They saw me more like a younger cousin or a daughter, but not their leader. So, the first lessons in leadership at St. John's, nothing was going to come easily. Everything worth doing was going to take time. Bonding to a congregation takes time, and I needed to settle in for the long haul. Now, fast forward a few years, just a few years. By the time I got here, we were already on the edge of our capacity for growth in terms of structures and capacities for ministry and all of that. And at some point, and this is probably 3 or 4 years in, it was clear that we needed to do something to open things up. At that time, there were 2 services, one at 8 and one at 10:30. Sunday school was during the 10:30 a.m. service. John Bellamy and Linnell Michelson ran the children's chapel before the 10:30 service, which was really popular. As many adults liked coming to it as their kids. But there was no real place on Sunday morning for adult learning. The Sunday school rooms were inadequate. They weren't in great shape. I know that sounds familiar, but they really weren't in great shape. And the pipe organ, as we said, it was dying, and the cost of replacing it was staggering. And it was really painful to consider, as I mentioned, because of the money that had been invested a few years before. So we talked about all these things, and we knew that we needed to add another service, which in the beginning, very few people wanted to do, because it felt like dividing the congregation. I felt like I was asking to send half of the congregations out to the suburbs to divide the community into two. Remember that? I mean, it was really painful. And the complexities of doing it were mind-boggling. We had to double everything. And we had to shift the Sunday school time to children's chapel. And the idea of different styles at worship was a really intense conversation. And the music minister at the time was not in favor of that at first. And so, I mean, we prepared for this, and we prepared for it. It took over 18 months. And at the vestry meeting when we made the final decision, I remember, Heidi, it was one of your first meetings, people were in tears. And there were some people who, if they were still here, Virginia Belcher, every Sunday morning would greet me at the back of the church and ask me when we were going back to the old service. Without question, right? And around that same time, and I know I'm getting the chronology, I'm sure I don't have everything straight, but around that same time, Betty Grimes, who was this dear elderly woman who lived on Linden Hills Boulevard, anonymously gave the parish a gift of $100,000. Blew us all away. Remember, our budget was $140,000. And the wind of possibilities was like a doors open that we never thought possible. Now, she wanted it to be for the new organ, but she said she was open to whatever the parish thought was. We started dreaming. We hired an architect. We hired an organ consultant. We hired a capital campaign consultant. And we assessed our needs. And it came back pretty clear. We had two very strong needs. One was for Christian education space. We just needed more space, needed a better space, and we clearly needed a new organ. And the financial consultant, the capital campaign consultant, was clear. We could raise enough money for one, but not both of those priorities. And he was pushing me and us to choose. Choose your top priority, because if you don't choose your top priority and you don't raise enough money, you'll be disappointed. So you have to choose your top priority, right? Felt like Solomon and the babies, right? It was awful. And we had this, one of my first kind of memories of a come to Jesus moment as a congregation. We were up in the upper room, which was the only meeting room in those years. We didn't have any of the other meeting rooms on the first floor. And we had to figure out what we were going to do. And the leadership at the time said, look, we have to do both. We absolutely have to do both. But if we have to pick the order, we'll do the Sunday school rooms first. Because it doesn't make sense to build, it doesn't make sense to build an organ if we can't take care of the children. And we actually raised enough money that we could just barely do both. Just barely. And does anyone remember what happened next? Yep. A fire. That was when a coffee maker blew up in the kitchen. took out the kitchen, took out the parish hall, took out the office wings, almost penetrated the church. I slept through it, by the way. Rex McKee was trying to call me, and I finally, like at 10 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was, I finally sauntered over here, and the place was just, it was a disaster. It was a disaster. Do you remember?
Yes.
It was so devastating. It also happened to burn down everything that we couldn't afford to renovate. I said it at some point, and someone said, don't say that to the insurance company. So it was. Now, here's another really powerful memory, because we were all in the mix of all that, and extra service, and doing all the stuff, and starting to think, and I thought, okay, well, this is going to set us back. We didn't have a bathroom on this floor. We didn't have a functioning kitchen. And we weren't going to have one for, like, months, maybe a year. So I was thinking, well, we just have to scale everything back. We have to wait until this crisis is over before we can go ahead with this extra service and all the changes. And we had an emergency meeting in this room, and it smelled smoke, and everything was, and I said something to the effect, well, obviously we'll need to slow down our plans for all this expansion and programming. And I think it was John Bellamy, I'm not sure, but somebody spoke and just said, we can't do that. We absolutely have to go for it. People need to know if they come and join us now that, we're in construction and we are just moving forward. And that's what we did. It wasn't easy. I mean, that was the interesting thing about how hard that was once it was over, we almost totally forgot about it, which I thought was a really interesting case study of like when what could be a traumatic event was not a traumatic event. And that taught me something about resilience, both from systemically and personally. That you can have something traumatic happen to you and not have it traumatize you by how you respond. Really important learning for me. And I also learned in those years that leadership wasn't about my coming up with the vision of things, which was really helpful when I went to Washington because I kept on saying, Bishop, what's your vision? Well, vision emerges, and my job is to steward it. And sometimes I might get a piece of it, but you'll get a piece of it, and you'll get a piece of it, and it will emerge, and then the leader's job is to steward it, and to treasure it, and maybe sometimes to goad the community when the community needs a little goading, but it's not about coming up with it all the time. But I also learned that the more daring the vision, the more it asks of all of us. We did all those things, right? We added a service, we expanded our offerings for adults and children. We got some grants that really helped us fund in advance some things that we couldn't afford to fund right away, so we began to grow things slowly. We tried a night service for years. I mean, a real full-blown Eucharist night service, and I really wanted that. I wanted that more than anything. Went to places like our friends at Solomon's Porch, some of whom are here tonight, studied them. They're doing some really cool things in the neighborhood. Let's be like them. Didn't ultimately last, but we tried. I thought at some point I could write a book of all the ways not to start a night Eucharist, right? All the ways we tried. But there was this emerging sort of steady criticism that kept coming from different corners of the community. It really caught my attention, and it was essentially, it came in different ways, but it was essentially saying we weren't tending enough to the spiritual lives of our people. We weren't giving enough clarity of what it meant to belong here to our new members or people who are exploring us. We weren't caring enough for the elderly members of our community. We needed to pay more attention. We weren't talking enough about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. And that was really hard for me to hear because I was pouring my heart out every Sunday in sermons, and I wanted to say like everything we're doing is spiritual. It's all part of this organic thing. But I realized, and we all realized that was right, and there wasn't going to be like this quick fix, like this one program we could buy, this one curriculum we could just place on top of St. John's and say, here, that's it, right? But it had to be eclectic and nimble and trying a lot of different things. If it was a Bible study or a book club or a small group, but that effort, and I think from that point forward, I just felt like we had to keep on putting stuff out there and trying it. And if we tried 10 things and 2 of them took root, well, that was 2 more than if we hadn't done the 10, right? But we just kept on trying. And I feel in some ways that that's a big part of my life now too. Just seeing where the seeds might take root and allowing people to respond. Social justice ministries also came to the fore in a deeper way, a newer, resurging way. Always been important to St. John's, but it took on a new intensity in those years. We focused on the city, what it meant to be a congregation in the city, did some research about what good congregations in the city were doing, and that caused some of us, myself included, to think we needed to join a faith-based community organization called Isaiah affordable housing became a priority, Habitat for Humanity, all of this stuff was kind of brewing, how to become involved in the wider community. And I started spending more time out in the community. But it was, I learned that I wasn't as effective when I was out there by myself. Right? And I could string a few words together, I could stand up in front of a crowd of people, but if you all weren't there, it wasn't as meaningful. And that taught me that leadership isn't just about having a microphone in front of you and talking about something important. It's about actually mobilizing people toward a common cause. Also something that's helping me a lot right now. Oh gosh. Just a couple more points.
Don't worry about it.
I only have a few more. So right around the 10-year mark, which the 10-year mark, by the way, when I first got to St. John's, Bishop Jelinek, who was brand new at the time, sat down with the vestry meeting and he said, 10 years. 10 years, that's the ideal length of a rectorship. 10 years. Because at 10 years you're not stale, you don't get bored. And 10 years is how long Todd Smelter stayed, and 10 years was how long it was like 10 years was sort of the thing. Right? And so I was coming up on the 10-year mark, and the dean at St. Mark's Cathedral resigned. And I knew I wanted to apply. And people in the parish asked me, "You're going to apply, aren't you?" Yeah. It wasn't a good time to leave St. John's for a whole host of reasons. We had just called Devin Anderson to be our associate. We were expanding and deepening our liturgies. We were trying to tend to all these things. We were beginning to have conversations, God forbid, of another capital campaign. And this one was started out because the one big thing left undone from the previous one was an elevator. We were not accessible. And the elderly members of the congregation were not happy about that. And when we were going to start doing something about that, and by the way, it gets really hot here in the summer, shouldn't we talk about air conditioning? But we're just starting. No one wanted to raise any money, but people wanted to talk about, this is right around 9/11, so the tensions were building around that, the Iraq War. We weren't on one mind on these issues. These were hard times for us. And I felt this tug to apply to St. Mark's. So, newsflash, it wasn't called. But it went right to the wire. And in fact, it went right to the wire right before an annual meeting. And I remember we were having like the vestry meeting, like what was the annual meeting going to be like if I was called? What was the annual meeting going to be like if I wasn't called? Right? And that was like on a Tuesday. And I got the call on Thursday. Now part of me was relieved and part of me took it really, really hard. And all those big conversations that we were having as a community now have this other overlay to it. Well, when is she going to apply for the next job? How long is she going to stay? And the bishop's office kind of made it clear that, he really thought I should probably be looking for other work. And by that time, he and I weren't always seeing eye to eye. Might have been another agenda item there. That took, I tell you, I was kind of in a really interesting time for about a year. And then this idea surfaced in my head. It felt like a real answer to prayer. And I began I started thinking back on our time together, and I realized that in those 10 years, we had experienced together kind of these big arcs of work that usually lasted 4 to 5 years. Beyond just the normal get ready for the next season, but real projects. And I thought, well, what if I committed, if the wardens and the vestry agreed, what if I committed to another 5 years, consciously and intentionally? What if I just said, look, I promise you, if you want, if you want, we'll go for another 5 years. And they said yes, but I had this real sense that if I was going to do that, I needed to learn new skills because you needed a different sort of rector than the one that I was. And we needed to shake up some things here. And the challenges, if I did it right, if we did it right, would be almost as challenging as if you had called a new rector, right? It was that kind of shift that I sensed I needed to make. I needed to change the way I functioned. If this church had any ability to kind of move to the next level of its development and its growth and its commitment and its impact on the community. And so I went on sabbatical right about that time, and I started studying churches that were twice our size or bigger. Not for their theology, not for their politics, none of them were Episcopalian. And which says something about the Episcopal Church, but it's something I think about a lot. But, and I came back and I just thought, look, there's some things we could do that are just, and one of the things we have to do is I have to stop being at the center of everything. I have to stop doing those things that if I were to stop doing them, they wouldn't get done. Right? And I was a pretty strong-willed person. I could make a lot of things happen if I wanted to, and you all were really nice to let me do them. Look at her, isn't she sweet? But I had to really assess, where was the energy of the community? And where can I invest in that? And how could I stop being the one who taught? And how could I be the one to encourage others to teach? And how could I lead in such a way that if I were to leave, St. John's wouldn't miss a beat? And from that point on, that's consciously how I led. And right up, that's when, and while I was on sabbatical, the conversation started about the next capital campaign. In fact, I read about it in the newsletter while I was on sabbatical. And some issues were surfacing. And they were being championed by our newer and more energetic leaders, I would say our visionary leaders, people who were really excited about the future. They were looking at the building and thinking about design and flow and accessibility. Everything was really expensive, way more than last time. Came back and there was all this sort of energy sort of here, but not a lot of enthusiasm here. And there was some resistance. And there was no Betty Grimes gift to kick things off. So it was a little, things kind of went in fits and starts. It seemed like a good idea, but it didn't. And I was like, do I want to attach myself to this vision? What if it fails? What do we do if we try something really big like that and it fails? What does that say about us, right? So I was kind of holding back, not sure what to do. Why were we focusing on the building? Many of you were asking when there's so many important things we're doing. The building was pretty. We had just done the capital campaign a few years before. The building was really pretty. It's the prettiest it had ever been, right? Why did we could stick an elevator, maybe a chute of some kind. We could do this on the cheap, right? Why is growth so important to you anyway? We're fine the way we are. The meeting space was fine. Sunday school was fine. We weren't in crisis. And I had this real sense of dread that this was not going to end well. And I was trying to figure out what was at stake. And we were all struggling with this. We were praying about it and thinking about it. And these visionary leaders had a sense of what, and I was with them, they were getting tired. And they were getting beat up a little bit by people who they thought were their friends in church, right? And I wasn't sure how much longer they were going to stick around. And what was the issue? What was holding us back? Where was the vision? People say, Mariann, the vision isn't clear. It's just not clear. What are we trying to do? What does it matter? And that's when I thought, okay, we need to figure that part out. And so we started talking about our commitment to the neighborhood and our sense of place and the importance of children and of spaciousness and about having space that reflected the life that was in this place, right? And yes, being accessible. And, so we're starting to get some traction. Okay, things were starting to happen, things were going to move. But still, it was a little, I don't know, this doesn't seem right. And then the worst possible thing happened. A young man died. Jeff Peck died. And beloved child of this community. He was in his 30s, early 30s, when he died. And for his funeral, people were in the rafters. Filled the chapel. All the way through. All the people in there, all young adults. This place was just packed. Was it important that we were here? You bet it was. Was it important that this space be gracious and beautiful and welcoming? Oh my God, yes. We were going to do this thing. And then the contractors came back and said, yeah, it's going to cost you twice as much as you thought. Or something equally disastrous, right? And I remember the leaders were just devastated because we had worked so hard just to convince everyone that we were going to do this, and it was such a blow, and we were going to borrow money, which was an anathema to St. John's at the time, and we had to borrow even more money. It's like, no, we can't do it. So we had this meeting again in this room, and the leaders just kind of laid it all out, and they came up with this sort of half plan. Okay, we'll do what we can do with the money that we get. Well, and some of you just said, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. We're going to do this thing. And several of you promised to help raise the money. Deanna Miller was in dental school, raising 2 kids. And she said, I can't afford to give you any more, but I'm going to give you more because we need this. And I watched the whole community. You know? And when the building was finished, for all of its struggle, we were simply overwhelmed by its beauty and its grace, its coherence and its simplicity. It's hard to imagine now that there was a time when you couldn't walk there. That space didn't exist. There was no library. There was no entranceway for families if they were dropping off their kids to go to the nursery, to go downstairs and come back up. They'd have to walk basically the length of a football field and back to get from that door to the nursery and back. And we did all that, and it was gorgeous. And I guess so after that, the last few years of my life here with you were living into what that space represented for us. And yes, there were conflicts and struggles and weekly deadlines, but what I remember most from that last phase was the sense of momentum and energy. Chad, you came to us in those years. Bill Peterson had joined the staff. Jay, you came on staff as a volunteer. And Deborah Christensen, Walter McKinney, there was alignment with the vestry and the leadership. We didn't always agree, but there was a sense of common purpose. And I tell you, I take that with me to this day, what it feels like when you're working together as part, and you're kind of in it together, and momentum is on your side. And that sense of joy, the power of joy. And then the 15-year mark came. And Bishop of the Diocese of Minnesota announced his retirement. And I knew I was going to fly. There were other possibilities, but this felt real and it felt true. I loved Minnesota, I loved my colleagues. I had watched our bishop kind of self-destruct in the last few years, and I was trying to figure out how I could do it differently. And I gave it my all. Many of you supported me. You couldn't believe that I wouldn't be elected. You were so sweet. Headline, wasn't elected. Guess what? She isn't universally loved. I actually have a few enemies, and I wasn't elected by the laity, and I tell you, that really hurt. I wasn't chosen by my colleagues. That really hurt. And I didn't know what to do next, because I didn't have any long-term vision anymore. And I like to think in those 5-year arcs, remember, and your leadership said to me, look, why don't you just lay that down for a while and just be with us. It's the greatest gift you could have given me, because this is the only place where I felt like I belonged was here. The only place where I felt at home. was here. And, but I also knew that I was, and we did some good things then. I mean, I wasn't phoning it in, but I was, but I also knew it was a stolen season. It wasn't going to last. And when the word came out that the Diocese of Washington was looking for a new bishop, it was the longest of long shots. But I started walking toward it, as you know, and I'd been disappointed before, so I was thinking of a plan B. The only thing I knew was that if I weren't elected, I would also be leaving St. John's. And I knew that. I knew that it was time, and I think we talked about it, that it was time. And I loved it because you were so supportive. And I remember someone saying, yeah, we asked your congregation if they thought you'd be a good bishop, and they said, oh, she'd be a great bishop, whatever a bishop does. What does a bishop do anyway? So I'll be happy to talk about that if you want, but I just want to leave you with a couple of, I'd like to leave where I began, which is just the deepest of gratitude and admiration and love. Gentle exhortation. It's really important that you're here. It's important for certain churches like St. John's and to be strong and to be open, to be welcoming, and to be engaged. I often say at confirmation services now, if you're going to be a Christian, be a Christian. Be a robust Christian. Follow Jesus. Don't follow a caricature of Jesus, and don't be ashamed of Jesus. He's actually an extraordinary spiritual presence and power in this world. And so take that discipleship as seriously as you can. And it's really helpful to have a few basic spiritual practices going, like quiet prayer, hospitality, generosity, forgiveness. And stay connected to this place if you feel called to it. And if you don't feel called to this one, find a community. We are not meant to walk this path alone. And occupy, those of you here, occupy this corner with grace and courage and confidence. And then go out and live your lives. This neighborhood and the city and the communities in which you live, helping God fulfill the dream that God has for all of us. And know that you're in my heart always. I remember you in my daily prayers. And God willing, I will serve as Bishop of the Diocese of Washington for another 15 years. And then we will return to Minnesota. And I look forward to taking my place in the long, dignified line of associate clergy. And rector emeritus.
Please join Mariann.
Oh, just one. I don't know about the others.